Lost Planet, a third-person shooter franchise originally developed by Capcom, ran from 2006 to 2013. Across three main releases, the series aimed to appeal to both Western and Japanese audiences, but ended up fizzling out over time. What journey did the franchise undertake, and why did it fall short? Let's take a look. At the opening of new console hardware, Japanese giant Capcom was one of the first studios to make the jump. Released alongside the horror beat-em-up Dead Rising, which arrived a couple of months earlier, Lost Planet Extreme Condition anchored Capcom's debut on the 7th generation of consoles. These two titles were designed to tide fans over until heavy hitters such as Devil May Cry 4 and Resident Evil 5 arrived. The company, still riding the critical acclaim of Resident Evil 4 in 2005, was ready to make their move with new ideas and the new MT Framework game engine to take advantage of the latest hardware. Extreme Condition, launching on Xbox 360 first and later on PC and PS3, was generally well received in 2006, and replaying it many years later, there are several elements that hold up well. If you can believe it, the game's multiplayer servers are still running almost 13 years later, but I'm unable to find a single player online. Taking place from a third-person perspective, the original Lost Planet sees the player fight their way across EDN-3, a frozen wasteland that humanity is determined to colonize. Across 12 chapters, it's mostly a straight shot across the levels, either on foot or in the many different mechs you'll find across the land. While there are target markers to find, the focus is mainly on combat, with a wide range of different weapon and vehicle options to choose from. In between levels, you'll have story cutscenes and quick mission briefings broken up by fairly brief loading screens with a little bit of interactivity thrown in. The franchise's closest relative would be the Monster Hunter franchise, which also involves taking on gigantic creatures. Take away the leveling and loot aspects of that series, and you'd be pretty close to Lost Planet. The thing that stands out the most about Extreme Condition to me is its presentation. At the time of its release, it looked absolutely stunning, and these graphical details were backed up by a very impressive sound mix. Whether it's the thunderous effect of a VS rocket launcher firing, or the roars of its alien antagonists, the game is always looking to immerse you in its setting. It's backed up by a solid soundtrack that matches the hostile environment quite well. But is there a gap? Yes there is, the frame rate. On PlayStation 3, Lost Planet 1 can trudge along, particularly when there's a lot going on screen. For all the technical strengths I mentioned, it's too bad there isn't a compelling narrative to go alongside it. Serious storytelling has rarely been Capcom's strong suit, and the narrative in Lost Planet Extreme Condition is one of the weakest in their entire catalogue. Opening with a fairly standard narration about humanity's colonization efforts and the alien encounters that followed, we're thrown into the action in a Nevik facility. You play as Wayne Holden, a snow pirate ambushed by the humongous acrid Green Eye in the game's opening. The soldiers are dwarfed by both the monster and the facility, setting the stage for the campaign quite well, even if the level itself is rather basic. After losing both his father and memory, Wayne joins up with a smaller clan of outlaws and sets out to take revenge on the acrid menace while learning the real secrets behind EDN-3's colonization efforts. What starts as a straightforward tale of revenge quickly devolves into a tedious slog that few players will care about. Unlike other mainline Capcom franchises, there's little of that self-aware, over-the-top camp on offer here. What we have instead is a collection of painfully slow cutscenes punctuated by bland dialogue and lackluster characters. It gets in the way of the action and often stoops to cringe-worthy levels at times.
Nice try, but things like that will get you killed, brother.
Bandero.
I was curious. I had to see the latest harmonizer model for myself.
Shut up!
What a waste to give it to someone like you.
In short, it's hard for anyone to give a damn about the plight of the characters, leaving the gameplay to pick up the pieces. As one of the first titles to really show off the power of the new generation of consoles, Lost Planet does have a very novel feel to it. Set on a frigid landscape where the cold can kill you in minutes, the series relies not on taking cover to regenerate or health packs, but thermal energy. T-Eng, as it's known, was an inventive concept upon the game's release, a ticking timer that stressed the importance of both hunting for data posts and getting through the levels as quickly as possible. Thermal energy powers the harmonizer on Wayne's wrist, allowing him to slowly regenerate health and therefore making him better suited to survive the cold. But when your thermal energy drops to zero, you're very vulnerable, and the many enemies on screen will easily one-shot Wayne into an icy grave. This forms a different kind of dynamic to the gameplay. Every attack you dodge, every blob of thermal energy you pick up, each direct hit with a high-powered weapon, and the number of times your energy drains feeds into the difficult nature of the environment and the player's fight for survival. Add to that evasive rolls to dodge enemy attacks, and a grappling hook for some light platforming, and you've got the full gameplay spectrum. Both complement the gunplay well, and the same is mostly true of the enemies you'll face. Following their introduction in the prologue chapter, the Acrid serve as the primary enemies through much of the campaign, and it allows the game to deliver its main strengths. They may rely on the tried and true shoot the weak point trait of third-person shooters, but in terms of originality, these alien foes are often very imposing. Aside from the hives that endlessly produce smaller enemies, the multiple species have different sizes, behaviours and attacks, which forces the player to keep track of danger from multiple directions. In addition, a large number of them can fill the screen at once, another high achievement in 2006. Using the many items at your disposal is a must in order to survive, which may involve digging through the snow or shooting out a door. Generally, there's a good mix of both open and closed spaces, ensuring things don't become too linear. The weapons range from standard fare to more exotic items like energy rifles, disc grenades, and homing lasers, which are all a blast to use in the latter half of the title. Of course, the biggest selling points of Lost Planet, and indeed the entire series, are the boss fights. At the end of each chapter, you'll take on a gargantuan creature that takes up most of the screen. They tower above Wayne, and are incredibly varied in their designs and attacks. Whether it's a giant rolling beast or the repulsive King Acrid, every titan is a thrill to take on, and in the case of the latter, you also switch between on-foot and vital suit gameplay to target weak points. Other boss fights trade out these moments for sheer spectacle. Taking revenge on Green Eye at the game's halfway point is the biggest example. It doesn't make use of every gameplay facet as you're strapped into a single VS, but the fight still makes an impact thanks to its scale and the powerful music backing it. The final component of the combat is the use of physics, which certainly raised some eyebrows among critics and players alike. In a push for more detailed animations and highlighting the size of the enemies, Wayne stumbles and gets knocked around throughout the game. A lot, actually. This gameplay facet is the biggest double-edged sword of the franchise. On the one hand, it makes for more intimidating Acrid encounters, but on the other, the constant tumbling can quickly shift from a mild inconvenience into something completely ridiculous. The pacing certainly takes some getting used to, with a slower aiming speed and having to turn Wayne around fully before firing. The addition of more realistic movement doesn't always translate well. Trying to target crucial weak spots can be finicky at times, and the quick turn buttons hardly remedy this issue. The lack of a sprint button on foot is also questionable, given how large the environments can be, and sometimes you'll have trouble figuring out which way to go. In the second mission, for example, Wayne assaults a rival pirate base, but there's no marker or objective of pointing you to a second room where the boss awaits. Turns out you're meant to run to this unassuming door at the back of the facility. Moments like this can hamper the pace and cause the levels to drag. Despite these issues, the gameplay variety does pick up the slack, and this is mostly down to the many vital suits you'll man throughout the game. Of course, powered suits have populated Japanese sci-fi for years, and Capcom should again be commended for the tech you can play around with. Every time you get into a new mech, there's a brief set of instructions that flashes on screen, educating the player on how to man them. While you'll start off with basic walkers that reflect the rundown nature of the pirates, in the later sections you'll get powerful vehicles that can blast around the environments and even transform into alternate forms. The Nevix Spider Tank is my personal favourite, with both its walker and drill dozer modes feeling great to use. The little details from the way the mechs activate, the AI assistance and the way they stomp across the terrain are all brilliantly conveyed in-game, and they set themselves apart from other futuristic vehicles. This brings me to the human foes, which comprise rival snow pirates and elite Nevix soldiers. While fighting mechs can be a challenge throughout the campaign, the foot soldiers really don't pose much of a threat. For starters, their artificial intelligence is very poor, and most of them go down easily with a quick machine gun burst. For all their aggression, Lost Planet's mech foes just aren't as engaging as their Acrid counterparts, especially when the game decides to throw in new mechs as bosses one moment, only to place them as regular enemies in future missions. They take on a greater prominence after the game's midway point, which also sees Wayne travel to fiery volcanic facilities. Unlike the Acrid with their defined weak points, you simply unload on the walking tanks until they explode. The game really could have benefited from a full-on damage model, with different parts of the mech being damaged over time. True, this was one of Capcom's first forays on the 7th gen, but if you look at how Bungie's Halo 2 implemented vehicle damage 2 years earlier, one half of the combat feels a little lacking. It's a shame then that as Lost Planet's Extreme Condition reaches its final chapters, the Acrid are pushed to the side a bit. Confronting Nevik and the Frontier project sees Extreme Condition move out of the frozen wastes and into more metallic, futuristic facilities. While at first the game makes attempts to mix both Acrid and human enemies together, it's rather limited in its scope. The enemies will mostly home in on Wayne and ignore other NPCs. The game's ultimate climax boils down to a couple of short chapters. Villains are taken out, most notably Nevik Lieutenant Bandero, in another horribly corny moment where he takes aim at Wayne one last time before dropping dead. Other characters pass away in an equally anticlimactic fashion. Yuri's death in particular is so badly drawn out that it slams the brakes on the pacing before the climax. The finale itself, a fairly standard romp in Wayne's flying vital suit, is straight out of a Japanese anime, with our protagonist battling in the sky with laser blades against Dennis Eisenberg, the overseer of Nevik operations. With a few direct strikes, the villain crashes to the ground, and we get a subpar ending where Wayne loses his memory all over again. The one interesting aspect of the ending is its final twist, the purging of the snow across EDN3 and the reveal of new environments, something which spoke volumes about the direction the series would take. While Lost Planet Extreme Condition didn't quite reach full acclaim, it did generate a cult following on both sides of the Pacific, and its position towards the opening of the 7th generation compelled Capcom to follow it up in 2010. As we went deeper into the PS3 and 360 generation, video games hit the mainstream, and with that came a greater focus on multiplayer titles. Specifically, cooperative shooters became top sellers following 2008, with the release of Gears of War 2 and Left 4 Dead to name a few. By offering both strong single-player and multiplayer experiences, the idea of value for purchase shifted. Following changes in the market and responding to player requests from the first game, Lost Planet 2 went all in. At the time, it was one of Capcom's grandest ventures, aiming to offer a full package bursting with features, as well as debut version 2 of the developer's MT Framework engine. After playing Extreme Condition, I followed Lost Planet 2 closely in the run-up to release. The hype was high and the many trailers released really homed in on the title's gargantuan scale. When the game finally arrived, however, reviewers weren't so kind to it. The controls, story, and seemingly unfair gameplay loop put off the mainstream critics massively. Based on these lower scores, I didn't buy the game at full price and got into it later after the fanfare had died down. For this retrospective, I'll be looking at it from the perspective of a single-player title, given how barren the game's online population is after 10 years. Upon revisiting, it certainly isn't as bad as critics made it out to be, but it doesn't reach greatness either. Lost Planet 2 was a lofty undertaking, a game that tried to do everything and ended up feeling less than the sum of its parts, something very endemic of the 7th generation. A constant pressure to offer more value for money, appeal to as wide an audience as possible. Many games certainly fell foul of this trend. 2 years later, Capcom would run into similar problems with Resident Evil 6, which also tried to satisfy everyone and ended up falling short. Lost Planet 2 isn't as messy or ridiculously nonsensical as that title, but it's not without problems, and they begin before you start the game. Many of the features the developer touted as offering the complete package feel either experimental or not very fleshed out. There's a training mode on offer, but instead of teaching new players the ropes, it instead asks the player to run through these half-hearted obstacle courses that have little to do with the main game. Then you have the character customization. On an aesthetic level, it's neat to mix and match items for your soldier, but the light RPG elements, clearly inspired by Call of Duty's perks, feel tacked on at best. So too does the slot machine, which is the main method of gathering Lost Planet 2's massive set of unlockables. Thankfully, this system was in place long before the greed of microtransactions began, but it's still far from ideal. Useless emotes and poses are drip-fed to the player on a frequent basis, getting in the way of valuable items. These components could have been streamlined or removed entirely so Capcom could focus on the core gameplay more. Picking up some time after Extreme Condition, the story fully ditches a serious narrative and opts for a broader one. Following the rapid reshaping of the planet's environments, a civil war has broken out among the many clans that have made EDN3 their home. All the while, Nevik is concocting another dastardly scheme to steal the planet's vast thermal energy resources and abandon the planet to its fate. Lost Planet 2 has no interest in depth or complexity here. The game takes place across 6 chapters, each following a different team of soldiers. With this highly militaristic tone, not to mention the characters' faces mostly being covered by masks and other headgear, there's no time dedicated to developing any of them. And yet, despite its incredibly thin narrative, Lost Planet 2's story actually ends up feeling like an improvement over the original. Why? Because it knows it's unimportant and gets out of the way quickly, allowing the player to race to the action. Perhaps there could have been one clearly defined soldier from each faction to follow along, but it's not something that harms the game itself. When you first start Lost Planet 2, the game's focus is immediately apparent. An arcade-style adventure for you and ideally 3 friends to run amok in. As you go through the campaign, the game gives you several objectives to meet, known as Good Job Awards. Achieving these, hitting weak points and defeating bosses, earns you credits inside these magic boxes, which can then be spent on your character. Similar to Halo Reach, which came out a few months later, Lost Planet 2 aims to unify the experience across both single and multiplayer modes, with your persistent character partaking in both sides of the game. Beginning with a short prologue section, a band of snow pirates similar to Wayne make their way through the wastes, as the game clumsily layers its tutorials through a set of screens. It's an awkward start to say the least. While the gameplay is intact with the welcome addition of a sprint feature, this sequel doesn't make a strong impression at first. The controls also take some getting used to. Holding down start to recharge your health more quickly and mashing circle again to activate posts can be cumbersome. Thermal energy is still present as well, but its significance has been notably reduced. It doesn't tick away as fast due to the new environments, and data posts are placed closer together. You'll often find yourself maxing out at 9,999 units. Once you board the helicopter and take off to the jungle for the game's first chapter though, things improve a fair bit. The new jungle environment is both detailed and unforgiving, really showing off the game's upgraded engine. As you venture deeper in, you'll engage both jungle pirates and new acrid monsters in a wide array of facilities. One defense segment involving drills features a multi-level pit where you have the choice between fighting on the ground or clambering up for ranged combat. One random quick-time event later and you're heading to the exit. The final boss of Chapter 1 is where Lost Planet 2 really makes its mark, the point where the game's dynamic systems start to come into play. Taking place in a huge arena, this salamander-looking thing prowls about, the cone on its back and 6 legs open to attack. Taking out both of these causes the boss to fall, allowing the player to climb inside, yes, climb inside its mouth, and attack from within for extra damage. When I first played the game in 2010, I'd never seen anything like this before. The way the game offered so many options to take on the monster was very impressive at the time, and I was excited to see what other explosive set pieces the game had to offer. Chapter 2 ends up feeling more modest, however. After entering an unnamed dock via underwater vital suits, a rather basic infiltration mission ensues. You simply have to avoid the searchlights before entering into more close combat in a trashy city environment. Attempting to branch off into different gameplay styles isn't one of Lost Planet's finest moments, and despite its best efforts, the gameplay sandbox is unable to expand. The second level falls most in line with Extreme Condition, with a fairly standard combo of foot soldiers and vital suits, alongside many auto turrets serving as the adversaries. Once you reach the end, you'll watch a Category G acrid get its face blown off.
It's going after the railway gun.
Thermal energy levels are off the scale. They're not trying to fire that thing, are they?
Why don't you chew on this instead?
Quite the epic cinematic moment, but the boss fight is rather standard. The bright orange weak points jutting out, with the monster jumping all over the place and laying on different attacks. The fight does end up outstaying its welcome as a result. This is where Lost Planet 2's inconsistencies show. Its ambitions may be high, but it doesn't always deliver fully on its potential for dynamic gameplay. The title is at its best when it focuses closely on its strengths, while also offering the player full freedom in its sandbox. As hyperbolic as it sounds, there are things you can do in Lost Planet 2 that you won't find in other releases of its kind. When all the pieces fit together, it becomes a highly enjoyable experience. Hitching a ride on vital suits, shooting thermal energy to your comrades, and best of all, loading, charging and firing a gargantuan railgun in Episode 3, which stands as arguably the game's best example of escalation. We follow a team of dusty pirates clinging to the fringes of the planet, often losing just as much as they gain on their missions. You start off desperately trying to escape a colossal burrowing acrid, and, well, just look at it. At the time, this kind of scale was only matched by Shadow of the Colossus on the PlayStation 2. Following on from this, you'll head for the hills, taking on acrid that hunt by sound, before finally hijacking another train, the same one that fled at the end of the previous chapter. It's a perilous battle across the train carriages, with falling off resulting in instant death. This is where a lot of reviewers at the time lost their temper with Lost Planet 2, the constant explosions sending you flying off the train. Playing on normal, I was able to move through the level without much issue, only pushing forward when it was clear. Once you take control of this super weapon, it's time for payback. Charging and firing the cannon, alongside maintaining the health of the train, is a fitting end to the chapter. It reminded me of the boss battle with Irving in Resident Evil 5, as the Category G Acrid makes similar movements to follow you along. It's all a lot of fun when the control issues and cheat moments don't rear their ugly heads. Critics pointed out the countless cheat deaths and awful AI as the main issues. I can admit that the enemy AI is pretty atrocious, but the other points of contention didn't get in my way all that much. The intelligence of your teammates is situational. While they can't employ any advanced tactics, they do help out when the situation demands it, whether it's activating data posts or moving key items in boss fights. I only had one unfair death in my playthrough, and this was jumping onto a train that hadn't stopped moving. Generally, if you hang back and don't try to rush the opposition, you'll avoid the knockback while maintaining a healthy battle gauge. This is essentially your team's lives, and when it drops to 0, the game is over. The set pieces certainly aren't lacking in variety either. Chapter 4 features a nighttime assault on a Nevik facility to reach a rocket. Here, the game gets creative with its enemies by having human foes alongside Acrid infused with weaponry to use against the player. Followed up by some escapades underwater. If you're willing to buy into the absurdity of it all, this level also makes a good impact. Later in the game, we head back to the desert with the wildest faction of the bunch.
Incoming! Damn it! There is nothing here! Then what were they doing all the way out here? They were spending all of their time...
Blatant stereotypes aside, the 5th chapter boasts another grand spectacle. It's all about taking over a giant hovering vehicle and holding onto it for the duration. There's a great build-up as you charge the freighter on hover bikes, engage the troops inside, and then activate the data posts. From here, you'll be running all over the deck, shooting down Nevik transports trying to land, and last but not least, using a powerful laser cannon to take on rival transports, and a giant spider boss to top things off. It's easily the most action-focused segment of the game, and a high showcase for the game's sandbox. The only problem? A defense section where if the enemy captures 2 data posts, the game is immediately over and you get booted back to the start of the chapter. A lack of checkpoints is a major pet peeve of mine in gaming. While it's suitable for master of higher difficulties, I can't accept a game booting a player all the way back to the start for something that's out of their control. This is one of the rare instances where the friendly AI can't be counted on, as they're unable to account for objectives to be defended and the various pathways to them. Lost Planet 2's final chapter promises a showdown of epic proportions, with all the factions coming together to take down the Over-G Acrid, the most powerful creature on the planet, and the central source of its thermal energy supply. Based on the build-up, you'd expect an awesome final battle. Things begin well enough as the Nevik spies reach the space station. With the backdrop of EDN3 down below and the addition of zero gravity, the mech fights grow more engaging here. Battling your way up a large tower, you board the most advanced vital suits, and after mopping up the last defenders, blast your way back down to the planet. The music swells into an epic crescendo as the commander compels all snow pirates to join together.
Snow pirates on EDN3. I have a warning of utmost urgency. The military forces you know as Nevik are planning something that will be catastrophic for all who dwell on this planet. I know this because I used to work for Nevik. I believe in their goal to bring order to this planet. Now I know that goal is a lie, and their true aims have always been to amass thermal energy. That is why I abandoned Nevik. Now they are trying to awaken the slumbering Over-G Acrid that lies beneath the planet's surface, and this will unleash massive amounts of thermal energy. Nevik will take all this thermal energy and then abandon the planet to its fate. But that is not all. If Nevik is not stopped, and we do not prevent the awakening of the Over-G, then the sudden and terrible introduction of such large quantities of thermal energy will set off a reaction that will freeze this planet to its very core and kill everyone and everything living here. For the better part of a century, you assumed that any land you had could be lost at any time, and if that happened, you would just start over somewhere else. But
In terms of presentation and the massive amount of effort poured into it, I was reminded of Avengers Endgame's final act. It's just too bad we don't have any characters to care about in this set piece. After crash landing in the snow, however, Capcom stretches things out with a tacked-on defense segment, and later a fight with giant worms that guard the entrance to the Acrid Hive. The game narrows into passageways on your way to the centre, a bright orange glow dazzling you all the way. You do feel like you're heading into the belly of the beast, though a lack of cover here means you're likely to die more from these giant orbs sprouting from the nest rather than the regular enemies. So you fight all the way through this hellscape, taking out countless spawning pods, reach the over-G8 grid, and it's a giant blob of sentient thermal energy. Well, this is rather disappointing, even more so when you simply attach a beacon to it and the game finishes things off for you. After some very inventive, multifaceted boss fights in previous chapters, the final enemy, and the one the game has been building up to so much, stands as a large letdown. It's almost as if Capcom ran out of money or time and couldn't create a climax that reflects the huge scale they were going for. Ultimately, a very unsatisfying conclusion to a game with such massive ambitions. As the nameless soldiers wade through the seemingly infinite pools of thermal energy and ride off in their transports, it's hard not to feel underwhelmed. When taken as a whole package, Lost Planet 2 offers some good fun, but the idiosyncrasies in its feature sets and inconsistencies in its campaign hold it back from being memorable. Despite being very well produced, it simply lacks the engagement and succinct production of the AAA games it wants to live up to. With this conclusion, the ambitions of the series effectively fizzled out. Lost Planet 2 sold under expectations, managing 1.5 million in sales in its first 3 months. Placed alongside a mixed critical reception, Capcom's enthusiasm for the series was cut down. A final breath was drawn by the franchise under its original developer in 2012 with EX Troopers, a Japan-only release that was received positively in that territory. Following Lost Planet 2, though, the series would never again find itself in the spotlight. By the time Lost Planet 3 arrived in 2013, it was clear the series was on its way out in both relevance and popularity. A mixed critical reception and underperforming sales had damaged the franchise's fanfare, and as a result, Capcom handed off development of the third and final chapter to Spark Unlimited, thereby downgrading to AA status and running on the commonly used Unreal 3 engine. While the series creator Kenji Ogura remained on board, there was no doubt that Lost Planet had become a very different beast, and players were asked to forget almost everything they knew about the series for the third entry. I had never played Lost Planet 3 before this retrospective, mainly because I was caught up in larger, more standout titles like The Last of Us, BioShock Infinite, and Grand Theft Auto 5. Released among these heavyweights of the industry, and with new consoles looming, Lost Planet 3 didn't have much of a chance, scraping past 25,000 units in its first week on sale. Critics gave it mostly mediocre reviews. I can't help but feel the same. With the seemingly final conclusion at the end of Lost Planet 2, the only way for the story to go was backwards. So Lost Planet 3 puts us in the shoes of Jim Payton, voiced by Bill Waterston, one of the first workers to arrive on the icy planet. By contrast to the god-awful plight of Extreme Condition and the mostly harmless military focus of 2, the franchise's third entry is a more solitary affair. We begin underground as the elderly Payton, trapped under rubble with his granddaughter at his side, reflects on his life in its final moments, and the game heads back to when he first arrived on EDN3. At this time, Jim is just a regular guy, looking to provide for his family back home. His motivation is established by keeping the player locked in on his perspective, a simple and straightforward persona, and finally video messages between Jim and his family. The latter is used to good effect, masking load screens and reminding the player of Jim's goals without beating them over the head. I was genuinely surprised at the story's strengths. By making the protagonist more down-to-earth and relatable, Lost Planet 3 has something that Capcom missed, the makings of a story you're interested in following. It does this with the other characters as well, moving away from the gruff military grunts that came before. Early on, you'll meet Gale Holden, the father of Wayne in the original title. How he went from a kooky engineering wizard to a gruff snow pirate commander is a head-scratcher, but it's not worth worrying about the details here. Interestingly, Lost Planet 3's story was nominated for an award, the Outstanding Achievement in Video Game Writing from the Writers Guild of America, but lost out to Naughty Dog's The Last of Us. I would agree with the game's nomination only partially. While Jim as a protagonist is far better than Wayne and all those nameless soldiers, the action surrounding him is fairly standard and not very worthy of merit. At first our hero is content with working for a few months, though about a third of the way in, he stumbles across a faction of humans known as the Forgotten, who feel very underdeveloped. They're written in the tone of a native group, people who try to live in harmony with the environment and not taking more than they need. Sadly, there's very little time given to them throughout the game, and towards the end, many of them are killed off without giving them time to grow on the player. By the time they start talking about Nushi, an organism that supplies the planet's lifeblood, the game is almost over and fails to make an impression. You'll find yourself invested in Jim, but not the action he partakes with, making for a fairly one-sided story. Booting up the first level sees Jim and his engineering colleagues crash land on EDN-3, which looks far more foreboding than it ever did before. It's a fairly ho-hum opening, though there's something familiar about it. Yep, those comparisons between Lost Planet and EA's Dead Space 3 certainly weren't unfounded. In a very different take on the previous games, Lost Planet 3 features a semi-open world approach with many sectors, story missions and side objectives dotted across it. You won't be scaling mountains to unlock the map or anything like that. Instead, the landscapes broaden and expand organically as you go through. As Jim adds to his arsenal, new areas become accessible, with the side missions branching off from the main path both figuratively and literally. Once Jim unlocks fast travel between areas, you'll find yourself going back to previous locations to conclude missions for upgrades to weapons, the mech, and Jim himself. Knowing that a larger world wouldn't suit the franchise's main health system, T-Eng was also reworked as a result. In previous games, thermal energy was your lifeline, protecting you from the hostile environment. In Lost Planet 3, it's been converted into currency, which ties in with humanity taking its first steps on EDN-3 and goes towards the aforementioned upgrades. These enhancements are welcome in a game like this, even if it effectively neuters the franchise's main gameplay hook. Also, it seems Spark Unlimited wanted to push the horror aspects of the alien Acrid slightly further. Lost Planet 3 is no survival horror game, but it ups the claustrophobic tension throughout. The hives Jim crawls through with a concerned look on his face, the abandoned Nevik facilities you'll run through, and the howling atmosphere buffeting the landscape all make EDN-3 feel just as dangerous as ever. The developer wanted to make the player feel isolated on this world, and the music certainly enhances this tone. However, while the story and atmosphere may be a decent step up from previous games, most other aspects of Lost Planet 3 are aggressively mundane. With the series' identity mostly stripped away, the title merely blends in with other samey third-person shooters of the time. Being the last year of the 7th generation, there were high standards for third-person games in 2013, and 3, despite its best efforts, can't create a compelling package. If Lost Planet 2 was inconsistent in its design, then 3 is muddled with its core gameplay. Spark did try to make something more cohesive here, but there's so many little niggling issues that they make a giant pile. Let's start with the camera. It follows a traditional over-the-shoulder template established by Resident Evil 4. It seems functional enough at first. However, when you get to the moments when Acrid are attacking from 5 different angles, things get rough. Because the camera remains close to Jim's back, there's going to be a lot of instances where you get knocked over or slashed from behind because you didn't see an enemy coming. The animations aren't overly delayed this time, but it continues to be a thorn in the game's side. Then there's the cover shooting against Acrid, a very odd and uninspired choice. Hiding from projectile attacks quickly becomes insufficient when other species are rushing you at close range, making the system mostly useless until the end of the game. It also doesn't help that the game's frame rate takes a dive when too many enemies are on screen, making killing them a slog. With the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 firmly established, there's little excuse for this lack of polish. Combat itself features a variety of weapons, of which Jim can carry 2 at a time, along with grenades. While they do sound good despite not holding a candle to Capcom's audio, problems arise with the aiming. Smaller enemies like these scorpions and the ranged ape that fire from behind cover are a massive pain, darting around and wasting your bullets. It's equally frustrating when these same enemies grapple onto Jim and need to be shaken off. Swarming the protagonist at close range with imprecise aiming controls is bad enough, but having the combat constantly interrupted by gratuitous quick-time events is a major annoyance that busts up the pacing. Trying to head back into previous areas to carry out side objectives is often a nightmare, with these creatures crawling all over the place and laying the damage on thick. Were it not for all these tiny problems, Lost Planet 3 could have been a real hidden gem. The overall design is far more committed than its predecessor, and in terms of content, the campaign is the longest and most fleshed out of the series, yet it falls short of this goal. Finally, there are the boss fights, taken either on foot or inside Jim's construction rig. They're certainly imposing in their size, continuing the series tradition, and pack a greater challenge than the regular enemies, though there's a couple of drawbacks that put them below the ones made by Capcom. Repetition and the length of the fights. They're often based on trial and error. You'll have to watch their patterns and dodge their attacks at just the right moments. The first battle against a giant enemy crab was tough on hard mode. It must have taken at least 8 tries for me to take it down. It's here that another serious problem re-emerges. Fiddling around with the controls can make boss encounters drag on to tedious levels, as you try to hit their weak points, only to have the bullets bounce off their armoured shells instead. Oftentimes these are blocked or out of range. This is also exacerbated by a set of unskippable cutscenes that you have to wait through every time you hit a game over. There's also the problem of bosses repeating multiple times throughout the game, something the first 2 titles avoided. Now, fighting in the mech on the other hand, awesome for the most part. Condensing the number of vehicles in Lost Planet 3 down to 1 may have raised some eyebrows, but Jim's pride and joy never loses its impact. Swapping to a first-person perspective, you feel powerful in the rig, grabbing hold of bosses and drilling into their weak points while stomping smaller enemies that get in your way. It's always satisfying, and thanks to the upgrades it receives, the Walker is a constant presence throughout the campaign. You'll be drilling for thermal energy deposits, hooking up a grappling line for Jim to use, and it also serves as a personal radar and weapon and ammo station. None of these elements outstay their welcome, and in the case of the drilling platform, the game gives you a breather between wave defenses to repair your vehicle on the fly. The developer clearly wanted this machine to be a fundamental part of the experience, and they succeeded, making it the best aspect of the game. Out in the wastes, you're free to hop in and out of it as you please, but on missions you may be locked in or out of the mech, which limits the player's options somewhat. Proceeding on through the game with the world opened up, the fast travel system becomes more necessary, and more side missions open up as well. Some of these are fairly basic, heading back to planted data posts to collect the energy stored within. Others involve scanning the various acrid species with Jim's DNA rounds. This is certainly an interesting idea, and it fits in well with the new arrivals on the planet who are keen to study the wildlife. But other than filling in a bestiary and occasionally finding a rare species, it's rather limited. These side quests could have added further improvements to Jim's combat skills, allowing him to engage the aliens more effectively. But because of vague direction and wandering back and forth between locations, I ended up skipping most of them and pressed on towards the endgame. I don't recommend completing Lost Planet 3 100%, you'll just end up wandering back and forth aimlessly. Eventually, Nevik shows up to oversee the operation, complete with their shiny combat suits. From here, the conclusion isn't far away, and it doesn't do a great job of harnessing the story's initial strengths. The point of no return comes when Jim talks to Gale about commencing their sabotage, at which point you'll be unable to finish any more side content, though the game does make a save file for you to come back later. The final hours of Lost Planet 3 take an abrupt swerve in both narrative and gameplay. As Jim stumbles across the frozen corpse of Dr. Roman, he immediately runs back to the Forgotten and dives headfirst into taking on Nevik. Like the first game, it puts the acrid to the side and feels more jarring as a result. I was expecting Jim's distrust to rise a bit more before he turned against them fully. Climbing back to the summit, You start fighting corporate soldiers in a generic cover-based format. It's not very good, I'm afraid. The human enemies here are just as dumb as they were in previous games, hiding behind cover and just waiting for Jim to take them out. This section feels like it was thrown in to appeal to mainstream audiences and doesn't fit at all. Once you clear out these disposable grunts, you take on LaRoche buckled inside your mech suits. This fares a little better, as the misguided engineer has a range of attacks and a shield around the cockpit, forcing you to make use of several functions as you tear down the powered suit. The on-foot combat drags on, however, as Jim races to the Forgotten's camp, only to be captured by Nevek. Following a brief escape sequence that concludes with Jim's underused boss Braddock sacrificing himself, our protagonist heads off to Nushi. Jim takes on the underwhelming antagonist Colonel Isengard, seemingly a different member of the family here, just as Wayne did at the end of Extreme Condition. This final boss isn't all that difficult, but it could be the best of the trilogy, at least for its first stage. Setting Jim's mech on drill mode, you'll be firing at multiple weak points and distracting the heavily armed foe with aquas spawning out of the ground. The flashy effects make it satisfying to take him apart piece by piece. Unfortunately, in a staunch commitment to replicating the worst cliches of the 7th gen, the real final encounter is a lackluster QuickTime event where you beat Isengard down in hand-to-hand combat. After that, it's all over. Choosing to remain on EDN-3 with his family, the elderly Jim's story ends as he passes away, leaving his extended family of snow pirates to fight off Nevek in the future. Gale presumably hooks up with Mira, it's never really elaborated on, and build the first harmonizers, which brings us to Wayne in the original title. Much like the rest of the game, Lost Planet 3 has some good moments, but it can't keep up the momentum. Be that as it may, it does manage to create a solid bridge between itself and Extreme Condition. In conclusion, the Lost Planet franchise was an interesting experiment from Capcom, but it could never become as popular as their other franchises. The three games are certainly distinct from each other. Extreme Condition showcased what the next generation could do, 2 tried to be the definitive package, and 3 settled into a predictable rhythm, blending into the background as a result. Much like EDN3 itself, the series would fade away into nothingness shortly after 2013. While it tided players over at first, the franchise's ambitions fell to mixed review scores that slowly chipped away at its overall popularity. As it became less financially viable, Capcom chose to move on, struggling with its growing pains for some time. From trying their luck with edgy Western reboots like Bionic Commando, to getting involved in some dodgy on-disc DLC practices, the developer's reputation was dampened for some time. Yet since 2019, Capcom have successfully emerged from the rut they found themselves in through the early 2010s, going back to the drawing board and reviving many of their top franchises. Resident Evil 7, Devil May Cry 5, Monster Hunter World, these titles have reaffirmed their place in the gaming market, not just in Japan but worldwide. New IPs, however, are now a rare occurrence, perhaps speaking to the company's greater reliance on the tried and true. While Capcom may have found their way out of their reputational blizzard, their future is likely to be a familiar one. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective on one of Capcom's overlooked franchises. For fans of the studio, there's a few channels I'd like to shout out who have done some brilliant work on their main IPs. The Sphere Hunter, The Gaming Brit Show, and Avalanche Reviews, who I've linked in the description. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.